Hello and welcome to the Collegium, our monthly magazine program in 3 parts: cinema, state of affairs, and our arts calendar. For our Cinema 1 portion of the program, we bring you a one-day program from EINE gegen die Todesstrafe, against the death penalty, from the Free Mumia Coalition. State of affairs, we have a conversation with Gregor, who is also a participant and a member of the Free Mumia Coalition. Last but not least, our cinema presentation 2, entitled 12 Minutes. The story of a man in dire circumstances. So in addition to staying cool, remember you are participating in what else but the Collegium.
Tick tock, 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 tick.
Hello and welcome to our State of Affairs portion of the program, where we're very pleased to have a conversation with the gentleman Gregor. Gregor, welcome to the Collegium.
Thank you very much.
Gregor, you're involved with some very interesting activities. Now, for our audience that does not understand German, as you know, this goes overseas too, explain to us, what was that film about? What were those people doing?
The film we just saw was a little video clip we taped last year in autumn, in October, in front of the International Book Fair in Frankfurt in West Germany, the capital of the banks and insurance companies of this country. There was an international book fair, and we raised the issue of political prisoners, of the death penalty, of the prison industry, especially in the US, but also in other parts of the world. Right. The idea of modern-day slavery, basically. And we performed a little theater piece where we tried to give voice to the prisoners themselves. So we quoted loads of little statements and texts from prisoners like Mumia Abu Jamal, Troy Anthony Davis, who was executed last year, Leonard Peltier, a Native American who's been in prison since 1976 already, and others. And we tried to, through this little performance, try to make people understand that there is a system behind it, that it's not about so-called crimes, but that there is a social issue behind all this mass incarceration, not just in the US, but we concentrated on the US, and that the abolition of the death penalty touches far more issues than just the basic issue that no government should be allowed to kill prisoners.
Mm. How did you find those people, the persons that were engaged in the film? How did you manage to persuade them to involve themselves in that sort of activity, Gregor?
Many of these people have been politically active or social activists for many, many years, not just on the question of the death penalty or the freedom for Mumia Abu Jamal and lots of other prisoners, but general fights for social justice, against racism, for equal chances, equal opportunities for all people. Mm-hmm. And if you think about it, the case of Mumia Abu Jamal, which is quite high profile compared to other cases, deals with all these issues, not just his own case, but also the reason why he was sentenced. He was sentenced for political reasons. He was a journalist who dared touching important issues in the society where no other journalist would go. And this is basically the reason why many journalists try to go there, but not many succeed in bringing this in high-profile media. So he managed in the late 70s, early 80s, and this is the main reason why he was sentenced. And Mumia's case stands for hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of other cases. And this is, especially in the solidarity movement for prisoners, what we try to emphasize. We try to emphasize as I said, the wider issues, not just the death penalty as a cruel state terror act, but the racism involved in it, often, as well as the classism. Most of these people on death row, and especially in all the other prisons, didn't have the chance to defend themselves due to lack of funds. They were left with court-appointed attorneys who haven't got much time and resources as well to defend them. And you could say that far more than 90% of prisoners on death row in the US were not able to finance their own defense. They are there because they were poor. They are poor, and they are not able, even in the appeals process, they are not able to defend themselves. And so the whole question of the death penalty is much more than the death penalty itself. It's a question of justice, of the whole judiciary process, and the purpose of this process, or the purpose of the court system as such. We believe, or we have clear signs for it, that existing mass incarceration in the US, I mean, there's 2.5 million people there incarcerated, plus a couple of more millions who are in special prison programs, who may be doing work programs or have electronic food chains or whatever. But 2.5 million people are incarcerated. This can't be a coincidence if you realize that it is 1/4 of the whole world's prison population. I don't think that many people are aware that in the US, 1/4 of all prisoners of this planet are incarcerated. And the majority of them is working, not voluntarily, but forced. And they're not working things like what we know from the past from prisons, that they are kept busy with little tasks, monotonous and boring as they may be, but they're working proper industry. They're working on production belts, they build cars, they build computers, they work for the food companies, they work for pharmaceutical industry, and they do all this with hardly any wages, with hardly any chance of legal representation, because many of these prisons are privatized and they have no interest in legal representation of prisoners.
Right. So what is the relationship between economics and what you're describing with these prison systems and the prisoners?
Well, amazingly, first of all, if you look at the prison population in the US, you will find that the majority of prisoners within the US prison system stems from minorities of the US society. More than 40% are from African American descent. 16% of the prison population stem from so-called Latino communities, basically people who their ancestors came from south of the US border. Plus very high number of Native Americans. I mean, the amount of Native Americans towards the US population is rather small, but in prison they are almost 5% of these prisoners, so big part of the Native American community is imprisoned in the US. I'm not sure that many people are aware of that. And I could go on in further details and numbers, but let me tell you this, that the majority of the US population, which is white or European, from European descent, is only a little bit more than a third of all these prisoners who are imprisoned in the US. And what all these prisoners, all them 2.5 million people, have in common, that they're poor, that they're not able to defend themselves in court cases. I mean, there are certain legal procedures which we might not be able to discuss in detail here, which is the 3 strikes and you're out rule, or the plea bargain practice, which basically denies a jury trial to many people who are sentenced in the US. Just the other day I heard that 90% of all prisoners, be it federal or state prisoners, never saw a jury, but are in prison because they were victims of a plea bargain. It's an outrageous number if you come to think about that. Almost 2.5 million people never saw a jury, although they are entitled to.
But Gregor, what is the relationship between the history of the United States of America and the people that you just described that comprise a large portion, or the majority portion, of the prison population?
Well, basically, it's a historical line which was never broken. The colonies in the nowadays what it's called United States, the British and French and Spanish colonies, they had a big economic factor which was slavery. And the founding fathers of the American Constitution were slaveholders themselves. And although they postulated freedom for all citizens, they never meant to include the slaves. And it took another...
well, 3/5 of a man.
It took another 130 years almost, or 120 years, to formally abolish slavery. I personally believe, and I don't think that it's just my belief, that it was only a tactical move within the US Civil War to draw huge numbers of population onto the side of the North to eventually embrace the abolition of slavery. But nevertheless, it was officially abolished in 1865. But it was reintroduced through so-called black codes, to laws which would only hit people of color for ridiculous crimes, if you happen to think about it.
Particularly after the Reconstruction period.
Yeah, especially there. Yeah. There are statistics which claim that by the time of 1880, so let's say 15 years after the official abolition of slavery, that already half of the formerly freed slaves were in prison labor again, but this time organized by the state and not by private slaveholders. And pretty much the situation carries on through US history until the 1930s, 1940s, was only broken by the need for the US economy and also US Army to fight Nazi Germany, which was obviously a very important historical step in the world's history. So that was the first time African American communities, for instance, had some sort of empowerment because they were economically needed in the US, which wasn't the case pretty much before. I mean, before they were needed too, but as unpaid workers. Right. This time they had to pay them. And when they came back after the Second World War, came back to the States, they basically found that nothing had changed. And from there on, you see a massive rise in the civil rights movement. And bit by bit, the civil rights movement and its more radical parts like the Black Panther Party and other initiatives managed to establish some basic sort of human rights for all people in the United States, not just the population's majority. And there was a massive drawback on that. There was a massive reaction from states' power, from the government, from the FBI. We all probably heard about the counterintelligence program, which COINTELPRO, which intensively hit civil rights movement and did not stop before political murder and before wrongful accusations and locking up people for the rest of their lives. I mean, nowadays, in 2012, there are still people in prison who were sentenced on bogus charges in 1972. And they're still doing prison times because they were civil rights activists so involved in the Black Power movement. The case of Mumia Abu Jamal, although it's 10 years later, stems from the same interests, basically to shut down and silence influential figures who are able to analyze and publicly speak out on the situation.
There are two figures I wanted to ask you about particularly, and your opinion of their impact upon not only American history, but perhaps influential in world history. That is Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. How do you respond to their efforts within that period that you're describing, roughly the 60s?
Well, both were very influential figures. Martin Luther King was a very patient and very clever and very how can I phrase it? Very warm person who basically offered to the majority of the population, see that are our grievances, they need to be addressed. And since the majority of the population in the US did not address these issues, they had to deal afterwards with people who were far more radical and not willing to be silenced and shut down all the time. Malcolm X was very influential on the idea of drawing forces together in a far more radical way than Martin Luther King expressed it, he was not so much for discussion, but rather for confrontation. And he had a strong impact, especially on the youth in the 60s, who were not willing to wait another 100 years. I mean, 1865, the slavery was abolished, and in 1965, people were more or less talking about the same issues. So the youth in the 1960s said, we're not going to have this, and we're not going to wait for another 100 years. We want some decent and real change now. And this is the reason why people like Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, and later on the founding members of the Black Panther Party became so influential.
Angela Davis,
for instance.
Yeah. Have these people made contributions that are lasting until today, in your opinion?
Obviously, I mean, the whole idea of empowerment, of solidarity, of linking up between different groups of people and different, I mean, an interesting detail which hardly anyone talks about these days, that the Black Panther Party in the late 60s was one of the first Western left movements who were able to draw in loads of other movements as well, as far as people fighting for gay and lesbian rights, anti-war protesters, union activists. They saw the connection between all of this, and they managed to influence loads of movements which came up after them. For instance, the American Indian movement, they had influence on the Puerto Rican freedom struggle. And I think still nowadays, loads of the issues they said in the 1960s are part of our nowadays conversation, although obviously things moved on and there's far more analyzed nowadays about certain aspects, and there have been loads of experiments happening in the last 40 years. But still, the agenda, for instance, the Black Power movement put on, are still valid for today. I mean, otherwise probably we wouldn't have this conversation right now.
In your opinion, Gregor, what inspiration or hope or strategies does that period offer for us today and for the people of the future?
Maybe a little quote from Mumia Abu Jamal. He always said, without movement, there is nothing. And if we want to seriously change our situation we're living in, we have to become aware of it and we have to organize. We have to organize ourselves, form bonds which can't be easily squashed, and see all the connections between different struggles, and really take care about linking all these struggles, and come to agree on certain on central issues.
Do you see that happening?
I'm afraid I see loads of people trying to do this. For instance, if you look at the situation very local here in Berlin, but people are confused about the general situation. There's a lot of insecurity, especially in the wider population, and not many people daring to take risks because, as we all know, and what history from the US or from Germany and Europe teaches us, it's always a dangerous and difficult task if you set out becoming an organizer. Task, not just the stick of the general copper on the street, but also political repression is rife in all countries, not just in the US, and not just in countries where we always thought, where media tries to tell us about. I mean, obviously there's great human rights scandals going on in Asian countries, like, for instance, China, also in Europe and Russia. But it's not just these countries alone. As I just mentioned, and 1/4 of the world's prisons population is imprisoned in the US, and no one is aware about it. There are more prisoners in the United States than in Russia and China combined. I don't know if people are aware, if they talk about human rights and about suppression of the lower third of the population, that there are so-called Western democracies who are the main figureheads if it comes to human rights abuses.
Gregor, I'd like to invite you back to our next program, getting the cue that we have to move on. I really appreciate your ideas and your insights, and I think they're very valuable to our audience. So I thank you very much for joining us, and I would like to have you back on the next show. Is that okay?
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. So stay with us, and remember, you are participating in what else but the Collegium.
tock, tick 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 tock.